So hello everyone, welcome to this WTO online panel discussion on competition policy chapters in free trade agreements, views from negotiators. It is our great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Reto Malakrida, I'm from the WTO Secretariat and I'll be your moderator today. We are very honored to have with us three highly distinguished panelists who bring a lot of expertise to this discussion. And I'll start first with Mr. Arunan Kunanan. He is currently a Deputy Director of Policy, Strategic Planning and International Division of the Ministry of Domestic Trade and Consumer Affairs of Malaysia. We're also joined by Mrs. Simone Ritzek. She is with the European Commission's Directorate General on Competition, where she serves as an international relations officer. And we have with us today Mrs. Enno Wiranti from Indonesia. More specifically, she works for the Competition Commission and serves as its head of the head of the cooperation division. Importantly, all three individuals, all three panelists, bring to the discussion practical experience and expertise as negotiators of chapters on competition policy in free trade agreements. And of course, that is what we like to concentrate on today. So we have prepared several questions that we would like to put to our distinguished guests, and we have structured them by topics. So without further ado, we would like to start by looking at the link between competition policy and trade policy, specifically as it relates to these free trade agreements in which these competition policy chapters are included. So if I may put a first question to the panel as follows: what is the reason why countries include competition policy chapters in free trade agreements? How, if at all, is competition policy linked to trade liberalization? I'd like to put this question to Simone Ritzek, if I may, for a first answer. Simone, if you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Malakrida. So good afternoon, everyone. To reply to Mr. Malakrida's first question, I'd like to emphasize that competition policy chapter in the European Union's free trade agreements are not a novelty. So we have frequently included them in trade agreements with our partners now for more than 20 years. And in the early days, it was, for example, an agreement with Chile, another one with Mexico. The overarching objective of competition provisions in free trade agreements is to avoid that the positive effects of trade liberalization are undermined by the lack of rules on competition. So these competition chapters serve to address issues that can arise behind the border. So once you access a market, what happens then behind the border? To give an example, the abuse of a dominant position could block the entry into or impair the competitive position of those firms that are attempting to enter another country's market.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ritzek. Let me see if one of the fellow panelists would like to also express a view on this. Maybe Mr. Arunan Kumaran.
Thank you, Mr. Malakrida, and a very good day to everyone. When it comes to competition chapter, I think it's important to note that we do have the new 21st century trade agreements. And with that, I think competition chapter has become a mandatory chapter in all free trade agreements. It's very important for many aspects. Firstly, is to ensure you strengthen cooperation. Secondly, with the competition chapter, it's a tool to facilitate investment and also to provide certainty to businesses, because when you have sound competition policy or competition policy related measures in a particular jurisdiction, it provides the needed certainty for businesses. And in the context of trade agreement, whether this is specifically linked to trade liberalization, it is something that can be looked at in two different perspectives. Directly, you would say trade liberalization aspects are catered for in the context of the services chapter or the investment chapter, or even the market access. But the competition chapter would have an indirect effect when it comes to trade liberalization. As pointed out by my fellow panelists just now, it might have an indirect effect to trade liberalization. So I think that is an important component to see that whether trade liberalization, yes, but not directly. The ultimate aim of a competition chapter, in my view, would be to ensure that the market remains dynamic in a particular jurisdiction, and also the enhancement of consumer welfare. I think that is the two aspects that we need to see when it comes to a competition chapter. And when you have that, of course, it will provide the benefits for the businesses or the investors from the negotiating party. I think that is the context of why a competition chapter is very important when it comes to a trade agreement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kuranan. Having now shed some light on why we see these chapters in free trade agreements, I'd nevertheless like to also tackle another question that is related. Why do countries include competition chapters in FTAs, in free trade agreements, rather than choose different bilateral or multilateral fora for cooperation on competition policies, such as the ICN, the OECD, the UNCTAD, or APEC? May I maybe give the floor to Ms. Eno Viranti to enlighten us on this aspect, please?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Malakrida. And I would like to give a response to this question. So in the case of Indonesia, the Competition Commission is an independent commission, and we are not established under any ministry. Thus, we usually receive a mandate to negotiate a competition chapter from our Ministry of Trade. And it is our Ministry of Trade who decides the inclusion of a competition chapter in an FTA. However, we do prefer FTA to other international fora to create a legally binding commitment, basically because these international forums usually have a lot of members with different economic development, different legal frameworks, and of course, different national interests. So it will be more difficult for us to agree on a set of provisions, especially when it will be legally binding. Typically, FTAs have 2 or fewer than 15 members. Thus, it will be easier for us to negotiate and find middle grounds, while the other international forums are the ideal forum for discussion and for adopting soft law, like what we have done with the ICN, where Indonesia is a member of ICN's Framework on Competition Agency Procedures. And that's conclude my response, Rita.
Thank you so much for this very interesting response. I'd like to give an opportunity to Ms. Ritzek as well to come in on this second question regarding the link between trade and competition policy.
Thank you. Like Ms. Viranti said, also we in the European Union, we see the competition chapters in free trade agreements as complementary to our cooperation with other competition authorities and also other governments in the various international fora that we have, such as those you mentioned, the ICN, the OECD or UNCTAD. And for us, so what we aim at, and I think it's a question that we will discuss a bit later, what we aim at also with our competition chapters in free trade agreements is the convergence of competition rules. And yeah, this can be achieved through various ways. So the FTAs would be the hard convergence, so to say, while in the international fora, it's rather about soft measures. And I would still like to mention one more aspect here. So we have the FTAs, the competition chapter in FTAs, and we do work in ICN, OECD, and UNCTAD. But we also, in addition to this work, we have cooperation agreements with some of our third country partners or arrangements on cooperation with other competition authorities in which we still include more details then on how the cooperation between competition authorities works in practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very clear and insightful answer. With that, I suggest that we tackle another topic, and that is the content of these chapters. So far, we have simply assumed that everyone is quite aware of what we should expect to see in those chapters. However, let's just take a moment and look at the spectrum of ambition that we see reflected if we compare one competition chapter in one FTA to another competition chapter in another FTA. So allow me to ask you if you could say a word about the typical, if I can say so, content of competition chapters in FTAs. What is, as it were, on negotiators' menu, as it were, when they start working on a competition chapter? Can they opt for a light meal if they are not hungry, or for a 3-course meal if they are very hungry? And what would this actually look like in practice? I'd like to give Mr. Arunan Kumaran an opportunity to answer this question first.
Okay, thank you for that. Very interesting question. 10 years ago, I'll just put things in perspective when it comes to in the Malaysian context. 10 years ago, before the conclusion of RCEP and CPTPP or TPPA, we can see that we can opt for something which is much lighter, which is something that is of lower standard, something which is non-committal, which is a soft obligation. But prior to the enactment of our competition law was enacted in 2010, and prior to that, we used to undertake commitments which are more in terms of cooperation, very soft obligations, and this was taken with a very cautious approach because we do not have a law, we do not have a framework. But the typical obligations would look like adopting and maintaining a law, cooperating on issues of mutual interest, discussions, not even a commitment, but more towards discussions on anti-competitive practices, timelines, as you have for investigations, if you have any, and also how you should treat exclusions and exemptions. But over time, with 13 FTAs behind us, when we concluded RCEP, when we concluded the TPPA or CPTPP, what we saw is a more prescriptive competition chapter, a very broad approach. We have cooperation on enforcement such as coordination, notification, and we also have undertaken or committed to a prescriptive procedural fairness obligation. This is something that is very specific on the right to be heard, on what are the procedures that needs to be out there. Transparency is one, quite extensive transparency provisions. Private rights of action, this is something that is quite specific. This has also been agreed to. So these are, for some economies, we can see, or for some countries, we can see that this can be onerous. But if you look in the positive sense, this is something that is very good when it comes to trade agreements, because as I mentioned earlier, it provides the needed certainty. Yes, it takes a step further from the generic competition chapter that we do have, but this is something that is much needed by the business community these days. Is the, again, I repeat myself, is the confidence in the market. I think that is an important factor. But we do also have an extended version of the competition chapter, which is state-owned enterprises and public enterprises, but I will deal with that at a later stage then. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's interesting to see that the community has grown more hungry over time.
Yeah.
Let's have a perspective also from Simone Ricek, please, on this very question.
Thank you. Yeah, just to say that the European Union's approach on competition provisions in trade agreements is also not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we have slightly different provisions, for example, in agreements with countries that wish to join the European Union. But here now, on this point, I would like to briefly describe how nowadays the typical competition chapter in the European Union's FTA look like. So what we have are basically two parts. One part on antitrust and mergers, and another part that we have also included regularly in the last 10 years, I would say, is a part on subsidy rules. And while we consider that the subsidy rules are an important and for us an integral part, I will here focus in this panel on the classical competition provisions. And their main aim is to oblige the parties to an agreement to draw up or maintain a competition law which effectively addresses competition distortions, be it caused by cartels or abuses of dominant position. And as Mr. Arunan Kumaran said already, so this is the principal approach. So we have the principles, and then it's for the respective party to fill those principles with life. So what we aim here for is convergence. And in addition to that, the typical competition chapter sets out that the parties should have an operationally independent competition authority. We also do include a principle of procedural fairness. And finally, we acknowledge in the typical competition chapter in an FTA the importance of cooperation. As I have, however, already outlined in the reply to the previous question, the more detailed rules on this cooperation, such as notification and also more detailed rules on then how this works in practice, we rather have than in separate cooperation agreements or in arrangements between the competition authorities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ricek. Still looking at the content of the FTA chapters, let's focus for a moment on developing country interests in particular. Many of these FTAs are negotiated between or among developing countries or between developed countries and developing countries. So I would like to ask the panel, could you address, please, whether and how competition chapters in FTAs serve the interests of developing country economies? Or is it that developing countries agree to include such chapters in FTAs mainly because developed or other developing country negotiating partners insist on such chapters? May I invite Mr. Arunan Kumaran, to tackle this question as well.
Thank you, Redo. I think on this aspect, we can all agree that in negotiations, it's all about the benefits that one would derive from the agreement, which is an access to the market, tariff eliminations, and so on. So when it comes to competition, it is competition chapter. It is something that is cannot be avoided these days. It comes with a standard package, and competition is part of the package. So it need not be, it need not necessarily be something that is very negative that developing economies do not want. In competition, we should note that this is not the only issue that is being tackled apart from the traditional trade issue. We do have in terms of labor chapter, environment, intellectual property. These are some of the issues that the business community or the negotiating partners feel that this is an important element that should be part of a trade agreement. And looking at it in the context from the positive point of view, I think this is very important, because for developing economies, it is also important to use this chapter to ensure the effective implementation of their competition policy and law. I think that is a very important aspect that we need to see in terms of how the developing economy or the developing countries would be able to benefit from this agreement. For a new competition agency, even for Malaysia, our competition agency is only 12 years old, and I would consider that very new. Yeah, when it comes to in the realm of competition, some of the gains that we have received is through capacity building and technical assistance, where our negotiating partners, our trade partners, assist in the context of training and assistance, and also in the context of enforcement cooperation. If there are issues of mutual concern or issues of mutual interest, then assistance or the relevant coordination could be done. On the other hand, if you're looking at countries or developing countries without a competition law, how would trade agreements or commitments of this sort would assist them? It would assist them by this chapter becoming a positive pressure point. Yeah, it will encourage them to have the law. It has happened before. We've seen in some countries not having the law, and after with the trade agreement, they have started enacting the law. So I would say enacting a competition law, though it's through a commitment from the trade agreement, I would look at it as a positive pressure point. These are some of the gains for developing economies, and I would say this is something that is positive for the developing economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kumaran, for coining a new, very interesting term, the positive pressure point. We'll remember that one. I think we would like to also give our colleague Enno Wiranti from Indonesia a perspective, or an opportunity, I'm sorry, to weigh in on this question.
Sure, thank you, Reto. So in Indonesia experiences, the competition chapter was mostly included to the request from our FTA partners, particularly when those FTA partners are developed countries. For example, our FTA with Chile did not include a competition chapter, while our FTAs with Japan, Australia, and EFTA included a competition chapter. So in my opinion, this is because the developed countries have a greater interest due to their investment in the developing countries, and the number of multinational companies from developed countries that operate in the developing countries will increase with the signing of an FTA, because this will provide a market access. So meanwhile, the number of companies from developing countries that operate in developed countries is not that large. However, it does not mean the FTA has failed to serve the interests of developing countries, because the inclusion of a competition chapter in an FTA could be a positive signal to our trading partners that our country is market-oriented and pro-investment, which could positively affect the foreign direct investment. And for us, the competition authorities, FTA has been our alternative tool to strengthen our enforcement activities, particularly because our Competition Commission is currently not occupied with extraterritorialities. Thus, our main focus when we are negotiating an FTA is to include an enforcement cooperation mechanism to handle cross-border cases or a positive committee provision. So I guess that's my response, Rita. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wiranti, for making these very interesting and nicely complementary remarks on your perspective. We suggest to move on and look more generally now and sort of open the lens by considering the relative significance of FTA chapters in the international policy and regulatory competition policy landscape? Specifically, the question we would like to put to our panel is the following. How do you see the role of FTA chapters on competition in achieving policy and regulatory convergence among countries internationally? This is something that Ms. Ritzek alluded to earlier. How would you compare the relative importance in the international policy and regulatory landscape of, on the one hand, FTA chapters, and on the other hand, other policy and regulatory fora, such as the ICN, the OECD, UNCTAD, and others as well? I'd like to invite Mrs. Ritzek to give us an answer to this question on the relative significance of FTA chapters, please.
Thank you. Indeed, as I pointed out before, the typical EU FTA competition chapter sets a frame with principles, and within these principles, each of the parties to the FTA legislate. And in that regard, for us, FTA chapters do play an important role for binding countries to the same principles of competition. And these efforts are combined with our work in ICN, OECD, and UNCTAD, where we discuss with other competition authorities or governments on our case practice, but also on challenges. And more generally, we talk about our policies and rules. And in those forums, we work what I have called before a kind of a soft convergence. And we aim to facilitate cooperation between competition authorities generally. Ms. Viranti mentioned the committee provisions before that we also have in some of our agreements or cooperation agreements. And indeed, it's very important that the competition authorities do work and cooperate also on cases. In terms of importance, yeah, I cannot give like a concrete relation. For us, it's really the FTA competition chapter, something that complements the work that we do in other international fora.
Thank you very much, and that's perfectly fine as an answer, and very, very interesting indeed. Maybe I can offer an opportunity to Mr. Kumaran to also offer his brief perspective on this broader question.
Thank you. I think in the question of convergence, competition chapter of the FTA and whether it's domestic or international policy and competition, I think they complement each other. While policies and legislations have a broad framework and a broad outlook on the direction of competition when it comes to a particular jurisdiction, competition chapter of the FTA does not direct the policies or the legislations the way it should be. It is more specific to ensure the effective implementation of competition law, to ensure that the procedures are followed, to ensure that the right to be heard is guaranteed, and the independence of the authority for that matter. So these are the things that a competition chapter would specifically look at. How does it complement? It complements to the broader policy of a particular jurisdiction, but taking into account what is being done in the international fora. This, of course, provides for certainty, predictability when it comes to what is being done internationally and also the FTAs. But when it comes to international bodies per se, it is important also to highlight, for example, APEC. I was the chair of APEC CPLG for 2 years, so I will fail in my duty if I do not mention APEC CPLG. In the context of APEC, how do they work? They advocate looking at specific issues such as structural reform, how even emerging issues when it comes to FTAs of the competition chapter of the FTAs. And the APEC CPLG looks also at how to coordinate in terms of enforcement issue or cooperation on enforcement, whether coming up with the guidelines is something that is important. These are all the broad policies that will complement when you have a FTA, specific FTA with a trading partner. So with the international policy, with the FTAs, I believe that this will provide a very good combination, complement each other to ensure the effective implementation of competition policy and law in a particular jurisdiction. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed. We've now sort of covered, as it were, the theory of FTA chapters on competition policy. Let's now become much more concrete and practical and start by looking at how these chapters are actually negotiated in practice. Are there some lessons that can be learned, and is there some experience that our distinguished panelists can share? A first question in this regard would be the following: who should participate in negotiations on competition chapters? Should it be trade policy officials or rather competition policy officials? Who should be in the lead? Should competition authorities sit at the negotiating table or just be consulted, bearing in mind that they typically are authorities independent from the competent government ministries? So to offer a perspective on this question, I'd like to invite Ms. Enno Viranti to tackle the, to offer a first answer, please.
Okay, thank you, Reto. So based on our experiences in negotiating FTA that include a competition chapter, bear in mind that we are coming from an independent competition commission. We usually face challenges during the domestic consultation process, which is conducted, of course, as one of the steps in negotiation. Our independence and our status as a law enforcer sometimes led us to have a different point of view with the relevant ministries and sector regulators. And even though in the previous FTA, we managed to negotiate and find a middle ground while consulting with the relevant ministries and sector regulators, we take note that it could be more effective and efficient if the lead negotiator is coming from our Ministry of Trade. So in this manner, trade officials could easily coordinate with their counterparts from other ministries and sector regulators and bring their regulator perspective to the domestic consultation, particularly while consulting on issue of subsidies and state-owned enterprises. So a lead negotiator from trade officials will also assist in enhancing our government's awareness of the cross-cutting nature of competition policy and the relevancy of competition policy to trade policy. And as for your second question, we think that the competition authorities officials should sit together with the trade officials at the negotiating table. The main reason for this is time efficiency, because in our experience, when our partner has a lead negotiator from the trade officials, and we are asking practical questions on competition law and policy, they usually need to get back to their competition commission before answering our questions. And most likely, they will be back with their answer during the next round of negotiations. So there will be a waiting time for us to get the answer. Well, sometimes we are planning to use their answer as a basis to develop our counter-text proposal. So this is why we think that the competition officials should also sit at the negotiating table with a lead from the trade officials. That's all right, though.
Thank you so much. So it's good to organize a big negotiating table that accommodates a lot of participants. Thank you so much. I'd like to give Mr. Kumaran an opportunity also to weigh in on this practical question.
Thank you, Rito. As for me, I believe there can't be one size fit all. It has to be dependent on the way in which the practice of a particular jurisdiction. Ideally, we should have a lead who has both the technical and the trade expertise that would assist in addressing the complexities of the negotiation. But in the context of Malaysia, we have the trade ministry leading and the technical experts joining the negotiations. I think the cooperation has been very good because this cooperation is not only with the Malaysian Competition Commission, but also with the sector regulators, because it would assist in addressing specific issues when it comes to alternative proposals. And there is also a need to look at specific or technical issues. For example, you do have the issues of exclusions and exemptions and how you treat them, what are the public policy approach, and so on. So in this context, that is where the technical expertise is needed. But I would say if the technical experts are at the negotiating table, there is one thing that needs to be pointed out, that needs to be remembered, is they would need to have a good understanding of the dynamics of the negotiation, dynamics of the entire negotiations, because there might be instances where there are concessions made based on a bigger gains or on a different approach or a different reasoning. I think these are the things that a technical expert would have to understand the dynamics, so that both parties can work hand in hand together for the interest of the particular nation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing this important caveat from your perspective. And continuing with the theme or the topic of negotiations, in your experience, does the cooperation between trade policy and competition policy officials work well in practice? Are there any challenges, or are there options for further improvement? Let me give Mrs. Ritzek an opportunity to come in on this question.
Thank you, Reto. So in my experience, this cooperation between trade policy and competition policy officials works well. Just to complement on what was said by Mr. Kumaran and Ms. Viranti before, in the European Union, when we negotiate competition chapters that include also subsidy provisions, we do work together very closely with our trade colleagues, and normally there is one trade colleague and one competition policy officer in those negotiations. And well, to why is it important to cooperate and work together? I think both previous speakers have mentioned that already, because of the interlinks in a negotiation. You need to see, you need to have a bit this overview to see also what's going on in other chapters, how are the dynamics overall of the negotiations. But more generally, I think to have regular contacts also outside negotiations with trade policy officials really helps to avoid misunderstandings. As my experience is, although we all speak English with each other, we don't always speak the same language. So having a bit competition background, I use my competition jargon, which might well for someone with a trade background not always be easy to understand, and vice versa. And what we did within the Commission already a couple of years ago, we set up a working group where we bring once or twice a year trade and competition experts from EU member states and from the European Union, so from the European Commission together to discuss topics that are of interest to both of them. And actually it turned out that this kind of cooperation and meeting each other, it really then makes it also much easier, be it in negotiations or on other issues, to cooperate and work together.
Excellent. Thank you so much for highlighting the importance of really cooperating and getting to know each other well for a productive outcome. Mr. Arunan Kumaran, would you like to briefly weigh in on this as well?
Yes, Reto, I think it works well for everyone if both trade and competition officials possess the necessary skills and have the respect of each other's boundary when it comes to negotiation on trade aspects and also technical expertise. It is important to have a very good working relationship, because ultimately it's about developing proposals, it's about defending proposals, and when you are not negotiating, it's about consultation with stakeholders. And for that to happen, you need to be on the same page. I think from my experience, that has worked well, having technical experts and trade experts on the same page, defending a specific proposal and consulting the stakeholders, let it be other government authorities or the business community. It's important to have a very close relationship. And I think for us, it has worked very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that perspective. Now let's assume that we have completed the negotiations and are now faced with a question of how to actually ensure that what was agreed on is implemented in practice at the national level. So we'd like to take a moment to ask a few questions around implementation of these competition chapters in FTAs. So the first question goes to the following specificity of FTAs, which are by definition discriminatory. That is to say, they are preferential trade agreements. But is it actually possible, if we start from that premise of FTAs being discriminatory, is it possible in the case of competition chapters to limit the benefits of your FTA partner country or countries? Or do competition chapters in practice benefit all countries? Think, for example, of competition chapters that require countries to ensure transparency, non-discrimination, and procedural fairness, or to establish a competition authority. Could I convince Simone Ricek perhaps to tackle this somewhat provocative point? But I think it's an important one, especially from a trade policy perspective, where we are usually a bit skeptical about these preferential trade agreements and would rather have non-discriminatory approaches to regulating international relations.
Thank you, Mr. Malacrida. I will try. And I would like to link back to the very first question that you addressed to us, where I have highlighted that the competition chapters in free trade agreements are, in my view, necessary to complement trade liberalization, as they allow what was called by Mr. Kumaran the indirect effects. They help to address the issues that can arise behind the border. So you have market access, the companies are there on the market, and competition rules allow to address issues there. And so in that sense, I think it's true that from a competition chapter in an FTA, it is not only the partner of the FTA that benefits, but there are more general benefits also for other trading partners whose companies might have access to their respective markets. I would, however, not go so far to say that this benefit is open to everyone. It's only there for those who have actually access to the market. Thank you.
Thank you so much for offering your view, Ms. Ricek. I'd like to give an opportunity to Enno Viranti as well to come in on this question.
Okay, sure, Reto. So in my opinion, the principal aspects in the competition chapter, such as procedural fairness, transparency, and non-discrimination, will apply to all business entities without considering their nationalities, even if it is our trading partners. However, for the cooperation aspect and other cross-cutting issues, such as the subsidies, state-owned enterprises, these agreed provisions will only apply to the members of the FTA. So for example, we have an enforcement cooperation mechanism in the competition chapter of our CEP, and that enforcement cooperation mechanism will only apply to the members of our CEP. And as for your second question, we think the proverb that says the more the merrier cannot be applied to FTA, because the more members involved in an FTA, the more differences that need to be solved. And oftentimes, in the case of FTA with a lot of members, we need to compromise and decrease our level of ambition and commitment to cater to other members. Thank you, Reto.
Thank you very much indeed. This is very instructive and interesting to hear that you have to walk a very fine line to optimize your benefits and consider which benefits you're willing to let others share in and which ones you prefer not to share. Let's continue with a question that goes in a similar direction. What do we actually know about the impact and effectiveness of competition chapters in FTAs at the domestic level? Have they helped specifically to bring about concrete positive change in FTA partners' economies? To enlighten us on this question, I'd first like to give the floor to Mr. Kumaran, please.
Thank you, Reto. On this issue, I would say definitely the competition chapter of FTAs has got a positive impact on the economy. That is for sure. Why? You do have, at least from Malaysia, we do have many trade agreements, and our trading partners or our trade partners do not have specific issue when it comes to competition issues with regards to their businesses. So what does that mean? That means there is an effective enforcement of the competition law in our jurisdiction. So when it comes to procedural fairness, right to be heard, or any other due process that we have, their companies in our jurisdiction enjoy all this which we have committed to. So when we have committed to this, there are no complaints of any nature. Of course, there are specific complaints when it comes to competition issues, but that is being dealt with by the independent authority in accordance to the law. So what does, if you have a problem when it comes to competition chapter, is a non-fulfillment of the obligations. And that is something that we do not see because there are no complaints of non-fulfillment of obligation, and that would be a positive sign for authorities when it comes to implementation of commitments of the competition chapter of the FTA. That is my take on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Eno Viranti, what would you say about the actual change effected by these competition policy chapters in your or your partners' economies?
Okay, thank you, Reto. So unfortunately, there is currently no comprehensive study to measure the impact of FTA competition chapters on our economic development. And because all of the existing competition chapters did not adhere to the dispute settlement mechanism, I think assessing its effectiveness is quite difficult, as there is no government policy that needs to be revised as a way to resolve the dispute. However, the immediate impact that could be felt by the Competition Commission, of course, is the availability of a detailed cooperation mechanism with our FTA partner, particularly in technical assistance and capacity building, like what Mr. Arunan said. So this cooperation mechanism has brought about positive changes for the recipient country in terms of enhancing our knowledge and capacities of the competition authorities officers, and of course, in assisting the development of specific guidelines or commission regulations. Thank you, Reto.
Thank you so much, Ms. Viranti. In fact, your answer allows me to move us right along to a related question. As you said, there is sort of a dearth of studies currently. So how does any monitoring of the implementation of competition chapters work in practice? Is it based on reporting obligations that the parties have? Are the local embassies in FTA partner countries or capital conducting active monitoring abroad? Are there any specific challenges in that regard? Could we speak to, how you actually verify compliance? I would like to invite Simone Ritzek, please, to have a go at this question first.
Thank you. So normally in our competition chapters, we do not have reporting obligations. How is then monitoring done in practice, you asked? So to a certain extent, the EU delegations that are on the ground in the respective partner countries do help in monitoring in certain countries. So it's not, how shall I put it? It's not a general obligation for them either, but they do help us on certain occasions. I'll put it like that. Then, of course, the aspect that also Mr. Kumaran mentioned before are complaints. So companies can turn to us, to the European Commission, if they see issues in a given country. And then we can look into those and start a monitoring. But again, as I said, we do, and we have now also an enforcement officer within the Commission that looks generally in the implementation of FTAs. But for the time being on competition chapters, it's not done in, I don't want it to put it negatively either, but it's not done in a very systematic way. I'll put it like that. And you also asked about one of the challenges of monitoring. It's quite resource intensive, of course. And well, to follow also Mr. Kumaran in what he said before, we also take the view, if we have no complaints, it's a good sign. The competition chapter seems to be well implemented and it seems to work.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ritzek. Mr. Kumaran, since your name was mentioned, can I give you the offer to also share your perspective on how you actually monitor implementation if you are not part of a dispute settlement mechanism, as you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you, Redo. Traditionally, there are committees set up under the FTA to oversee the implementation of the competition chapter. It might be a competition-specific committee, or it might be a joint committee. But this committee, as you can see, will be comprised of trade officials and also competition officials. The committee, in some instances, the committee would plan on activities when it comes to capacity building, when it comes to training. On the other aspect, it will look at, the committee will look at the fulfillment, maybe on an annual basis, we'll look at the fulfillment of the obligations. Just to give you an example, we do have the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. And under that, we do have a committee on competition. And that committee is very, very active. It plans out training programs, capacity building programs, and also they work very closely with other competition authorities out there. This is to ensure that in the context of ASEAN, there is assistance provided in the context of training by more advanced competition authorities. And this we have found to have worked very well for our competition authorities in this region. And we welcome this, and we hope that this could be replicated with other trade agreements as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to recognize Ms. Ritzek, who has undoubtedly a desire to add something she forgot to mention earlier. So please.
Yes, thank you. Just to say that, of course, also we have under our free trade agreements, those committees, as mentioned by Mr. Kumaran, that meet normally on a yearly basis and do report, just for the sake of completeness. Thank you for giving me the floor again.
Absolutely, no, and thank you for clarifying that. So we've already covered a lot of ground in a short space of time. We have already learned a lot. We cannot let our distinguished panelists go without making them looking for us into the future and speculating a bit about future trends and further development. So could we tempt perhaps our distinguished guests to try to look into their respective crystal balls and offer any comments about what the future may hold for competition chapters in FTAs? Is there any aspect of competition chapters in FTAs that you think could be improved or handled better in future? I'd like to offer the opportunity to all three panelists if they would like, but let me give the floor first to Mr. Kumaran, please.
Thank you, Redo. I do not have a crystal ball, but one thing for sure, we can't run away from new and emerging issues. I would point out to two. One is consumer protection. Second is state-owned enterprises. On consumer protection, we can see there's quite an extensive or prescriptive provisions under the RCEP, where it mainly looks at fraudulent and deceptive commercial practices. And I think this is a positive development when you have provisions or obligations to take care of issues when it comes to consumer protection. It would benefit the consumers at large. Secondly is the issue of SOE. We do have under the TPPA or CPTPP, one of the most prescriptive chapters that you can ever find on state-owned enterprises. This closely relates to the issue of EU subsidies regulation and also closely linked to Australia's approach to competitive neutrality. The provisions include non-commercial assistance, commercial consideration, and non-discriminatory treatment when it comes to purchases. The question is, I think it's very important to put things in perspective. The question is whether the negotiating partner has an appetite for that. Whether this is a competition issue or whether this is an additional issue related to competition, but whether it's a competition issue per se. It is important to assess and understand the role of state-owned enterprises in a particular jurisdiction. They have different roles when it comes to every other country. And I think it's important to look at that rather than having a blanket approach when it comes to this matter. And the other question is whether this serves just the interest of one party, and what about GATT article on state trading enterprise? It's not sufficient. What about the WTO agreement on subsidies? Isn't that not sufficient? So these are the questions that is there, and I think this is something for the next seminar, since we do not have the time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kumaran, for putting two items for future discussion on the table. Let's see if your colleagues have more. And I'd like to offer Ms. Viranti the opportunity to look into her crystal ball.
Sure, Reto. Like Arunan, I also don't have any crystal ball with me. But based on my observation, the competition chapter in FTA focuses primarily on law enforcement. It has not yet delved into the issue of cross-border competition policy that may have an adverse effect on the market of other countries. As a result, future competition chapters in FTAs must raise this issue and include a mechanism to discuss or even resolve it. And on law enforcement aspect, I guess a procedure for exchanging confidential information, particularly with regard to cross-border cartel and cross-border merger and acquisition, should also be covered. Well, currently the ASEAN competition authorities have just finished developing the guiding principles for negotiating our ASEAN framework agreement on competition. And this framework agreement will hopefully include new elements, particularly on cross-border competition policy. So that's all from me, Reto. Thank you.
Thank you so much for offering your perspective. Let me just check whether Simone Ricek was also like an opportunity to share her perspective on this.
I'm happy to do so. Also, I have to admit that I don't have a crystal ball either. But, so be it. In terms of while looking into the future, I think what could be more important in the future is to look a bit beyond what I call the classical competition chapter before, so to look a bit beyond antitrust and merger rules. Also possibly venture into the area of subsidies. I mentioned before very briefly already that we do have in our template provisions, so to say, already some rules that come on top of SCM agreement rules on subsidies, in particular for service subsidies, that we try to include in FTAs with our partners. State-owned enterprises, as mentioned by Mr. Kumaran, is also an interesting topic. I think also not an easy one, because state-owned enterprises are quite often at the heart, so to say, of their respective countries and also of our EU member states. So to be seen how this further evolves in the future. Maybe one last point in that regard. It will also be interesting to see if competition chapters have to be adapted to new realities, such as digital realities, so that we have more and more cases on digital, or if that's maybe something that's rather for dedicated cooperation agreements or cooperation arrangements of work in the international fora on which we've also discussed today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ms. Ritschek. So we have just widened the spectrum of topics for all of you to consider and raise in the context of your future negotiations with your partners across the world. So plenty of food for thought there. We have already reached the end of our online panel discussion. I think it's been a very wide-ranging, very substantive, and also very informative session. So I really wish to thank our distinguished guests for making the time for us today and for lending us their experience and expertise. And once again, thank them so much for their input. Let me mention you all again, Mr. Kumaran, Ms. Ritschek, and Ms. Viranti. Thank you so much, and all the very best from all of us.